Gerald Holton is the Mallinckrodt Professor of Physics and Professor of the History of Science Emeritus at Harvard University. He was a student of Percy Bridgman's, working on the physics of matter at high pressures. And he is the author of over a dozen books in the history of science, including most recently one on scientific imagination. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has served as president of the History of Science Society. His talk today is titled From Vienna Circle to Harvard Square and to Boston University. Perhaps it should have been the Boston University Sit-Go Triangle, just to keep up with the theme. But join me in welcoming Professor Holton.
Thank you, Alisa. Friends, co-conspirators, I am so happy that I had the privilege to be allowed to talk today, and also because of my close relationship intellectual relationship certainly, with Bobby Cohen, who is an astonishing event in our evolution, being both a real Kulturträger and a wonderful human being. That's a very rare combination, actually. So allow me to tell you a little about our gene pool. That is to say, where did it all come from? And some of it you know, and I was allowed in April to have 5 minutes to survey that. Today I'm supposed to do a little longer, maybe something like 30 minutes. So this role, in a way, is to give a historic arc of how we came here today from where it started. And where did it start? I won't go as far back as Protagoras or Herodotus, but I will pick it up at an important point. And this way, I like to tell you a bit about your family tree intellectually and the gene pool that some of which you have. This enterprise, of course, has its own recent history under Fred Taube, which was marvelous, and I've benefited a lot. And before that by Robert Cohen, who in 1959 founded with Mark Wartowski what became the BU Center for Philosophy of Science and directed it for 30 years. But the founding of this group at BU also had a fascinating prehistory. And it was made easier by the transfer of the energy and the spirit of different but related enterprises that themselves had developed for half a century earlier. In this sense, some of us have in our DNA some really old genes, and they may not be, you may not be aware of them always, but they will kick in from time to time. So allow me to speak now a bit about those early antecedents, for it is really proper to talk about that in order to reconfirm and enlarge one's sense of self as an institution. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the banner of the bankruptcy of science was flying again. The authority of the old causal, Newtonian, Laplacian mechanics had failed, and it had failed also to seek a unity goal of the sciences, and instead gave rise to diversities that themselves opened the floodgates to metaphysical misinterpretations and theological mystifications. To be sure, even within the physical sciences, there was a fight going on. You know, candidates were energetics and conventionalism and relativism. very different from the Newtonian precedents. And of course, any such movement, bankruptcy movement, produces, by Newton's third law, its own opposition. And this reaction is something that we are the inheritors of. Because one of the persons who took seriously the need for opposition against the bankruptcy movement was a person who used to be very prominent, actually, but is now almost forgotten by most people, although he is also part of our own evolution. He is Abel Rey. Let me introduce him to you. He was born in France in 1873. He lived a good long life until 1940. His teachers included Tannery and Poincaré. He became a theoretical physicist, a psychophysicist, a historian and philosopher of science. At the Sorbonne, from 1919 on, he was in charge of the institute, which he founded, the Institute for the History of Science and Technology. He thus overlapped with people like Hélène Metzger, Alexander Koyré, and his student, Gaston Bachelard. He was immensely productive. He wrote at least 18 books, I know. None of them seem to have been translated into English, one or two into German, on history and philosophy of science, on ancient Greek science. Philippe Franck once put him in the same position as Duhem and Poincaré, for as Franck put it, Rey helped to integrate the philosophy of Ernst Mach into what Franck called a new form of positivism, unquote. And when the first International Congress for the Unity of Science was planned for Paris in 1935, Abel Rey was on the planning committee, the equal of others alongside him, like Niels Bohr, Bridgman, Carnap, Franck, Reichenbach, Russell, Schlick, and the rest of the usual suspects. To show finally that Rey really belonged to that tribe, let me record that Lenin savaged one of his books in 1908 just as much as he savaged Franck the previous year. Now, the reason why Abel Rey comes into our story is the one thing most of us know about him, namely that in 1907, Abel Rey published a book in Paris, his fourth or fifth book, called La théorie de la physique chez les physiciens contemporains. It was actually his dissertation. And that group of young and underemployed Viennese chaps made Rey's book the subject of their every Thursday cafe house meeting. I think until that time, these young people like Philipp Franck, Hans Hahn, Otto Neurath, sometimes von Mises, they really didn't quite focus on what they're going to do next. They were going to have a good time talking to each other about science, politics, philosophy, whatever. But the Rey book started something. And that is true, we know to be true from Philipp Franck's autobiographical remarks, in which he said that they used to meet regularly, but on that occasion, something important happened. And that is to say, they were discussing this new book from France, which, by the way, was translated into German the next year, and Franck wrote a review of it in 1910, very favorable review. So this book helped in a great way. They found that they had a task now to help what Rey had started in a way, namely a opposition to the bankruptcy movement. And one thing that immediately happened was Philipp Franck's publication of his 1907 paper on the Kausalgesetz, causality and experience. At age 23, these were young chaps still. Later on, the Kausalgesetz book was an elaboration of that paper. In that paper, which became a key to the career of Philipp Frank because it evoked the response from Einstein, who then became friends, and Einstein recommended him for Prague. Philipp Frank in that paper countered the notion that science was doomed. He argued that modern science was not at all a causally based matter at all. He, in fact, adopted the extreme view of Poincaré's conventionalism. In a key passage in that paper, Frank wrote, "The law of causality, the fundament of every theoretical natural science, can be neither confirmed nor disconfirmed through experience. It is a purely conventional statement." Unquote. Here I want to merely point out one aspect of the fight waged by Philipp and his circle. In those early years of the 20th century, the new thermodynamics, radioactivity, and the like opened new frontiers for empiricists to attack absolutes. They did so by embracing the notion of the primacy of statistical laws. After all, Philipp was a student of Boltzmann and would have been thoroughly aware of statistical and probabilistic views as alternatives to the ancient classical ones. This was undoubtedly reinforced by his awareness, while still a student at the university in Vienna, of the work of the great experimental physicist in radioactivity, namely Franz Exner, himself a former Boltzmann student and a member of a very powerful family. Since 1840, they had infiltrated the political and educational circles in Austria. And in an interview in 1962, Philipp recalled that Franz Exner gave a famous rectorial address, quote, about the role of statistics in physics. He said it may be the basis of physics, and physics would be statistical now. And Philipp added, quote, and it existed also, of course, in Einstein's fluctuation theory, because in the fluctuation theory, the statistical law is primary. Philipp did not need to add that, of course, the attack on absolutes already were well known through the work of Ernst Mach and of Einstein. But of course, we should also be aware that the attack on absolutes was a not very hidden fight against the stronghold of Austro-clericism in the universities and on the intellectual and political life. For example, in his 1907 article on the Kausalgesetz, Philipp ended the last paragraph, as is to make sure that the reader wouldn't miss it, the telling and surprising sentence, quote, with a worldview in the ethical religious sense, all this has nothing to do whatever. I need not remind you of the main events of the Vienna Circle itself and their sympathizers in Berlin, in Lvov, in Warsaw, in Prague. There are great books on all this. You have heard it before. But let me just recall the amazing ambition of this Vienna Circle group, which came in sequence after the little meeting in the Cafe House in 1907. On the second page of Carnap's Aufbau, as if touching on one of Mach's main tasks and echoing also the key notion of the Aufruf of 1911 or 12, Carnap declared his intention to be the construction of a system of concepts not only of natural science but of one total knowledge, a Gesamtwissenschaft, and so, quote, to overcome the splintering of the Gesamtwissenschaft into separate part sciences. In this, it would be possible to attain, he said, an intersubjective, objective world identical for all observers, and so make an end run around supposedly essential differences between physics, biology, psychology, etc. Unquote. Now, these sentiments found a promised place the following year in the great manifesto of the Vienna group in 1929, which I hope we all know more or less by heart. It was obvious an aim that Karl Hempel identified as the desire to remove the strong intellectual discomfort covering philosophy and particularly metaphysics. But the larger ambition was to sound a trumpet for modernism going far beyond natural science and logic. It asked for a world conception based on the Enlightenment, ideas that encompass the modernization of all life, from economics to architecture, from education of the workers to the formation of tools of thought. Now you can imagine that the political elite in Austria was not very fond of that idea, and so they closed down the Vienna Circle in a police action. Now, in October 1939, we're now going ahead, as a temporary visitor with a temporary visum, Philipp and Hanya Frank arrived in America. They were invited to give lectures at 20 colleges and universities, he came, of course, to missionarize this barbaric country. He had been for 26 years in Prague, where he was holding the distinguished position as director of the university's Institute for Theoretical Physics. He held what was considered the chair of Mach and Einstein before him, and he was very much admired as he was coming in, and particularly admired because there had been a preparation for his coming. After all, Hermann Feigl and Moritz Schlick had prepared the ground by their visits to America before, and in many cases there were already people of considerable similar ideas having been active here. One thinks of Staller, of William James, of Peirce, of Dewey, and of course of Bridgman. Many such people had also read Ernst Mach, which, thanks to Paul Karus, had been published in America, sometimes even before Mach's work was published in German. So there was a preparation, and one indication of how the audience was ready for Philipp Frank is a letter to him from Bridgman in March 1938, half a year before Philipp came. And this, in this letter, Bridgman says, I'm quoting, "I read the reprints and books you sent with very great interest. It is naturally a source of gratification to me that we can agree on so many points. It'll be a great pleasure to see you in Cambridge," which was on his list of the 20 colleges, "next fall and to talk things over with you." And in a second letter to him, Bridgman added, saying, "I really long to see you because here at Harvard, nobody pays any attention to what I'm saying except for a young man called Quine." By the time Frank came to give lectures at Harvard in December 1938, Czechoslovakia, of course, had been handed over by the spineless allies to Hitler, and so Philipp and Hanya could not go back. Everything he had worked for, his position, his colleagues, his students, his friends, his home, his identity, was gone. And from being a distinguished visitor now, he became an unemployed person without a visum. Clearly, what he needed was an academic position with which a new visum could be given to him. He could survive then in the US, but Harvard, for example, turned him down because, as the president is on record to have written, we already have 6 of those emigres. We can't have any more. It took the physics department particularly, and Harlow Shapley, to work very hard on the administration, and finally they offered a half-time, very poorly paid job to Philipp Frank as a physicist and philosopher. And he could start his job on a date, which is the 1st of September 1939. Well, what an ominous beginning. World War II began that day in Europe, and then something fantastic happened. 2 days later, Philipp Frank somehow, from the depths of despair, reached a high level of acceptance, because on September 3rd was the beginning of a one-week-long International Congress for the Unity of Science, held at Harvard on this topic, Logic in Science, started September 3. Bridgman and Quine were effectively the convokers. Philipp Frank was on their side. In an act of very clever politics, Harvard President Conan was the official greeter of this first session. Think about that. What president of a university in Europe would have given Frank and all these people a reception like that? Philipp appeared prominently on the program twice in a surrealistic way. He found himself surrounded by many of his colleagues who had come to America in order to be at that occasion. And I think I read you in April the list, a part of the list of this fantastic group that suddenly came here, and many of them were now refugees themselves. And well, we have had Conan and Bridgman, Neurath and Morris. I'm talking about the invited list, not everybody could turn up. George Sarton, Jörg Jorgensen, Hans Reichenbach, Richard von Mises, who stayed at Harvard, Rudolf Carnap, Susan Langer, Herbert Feigl, Sidney Hook, Weizmann, Lawrence Henderson, Charles Morris, Karl Hempel, Henry Margenau, Werner Jäger, Talcott Parsons, De Santillana, S.S. Stevens, Kurt Lewin, Hans Kelsen. What a group. Wish we had had a movie and a sound record of that event. Quite spectacular. Well, what did Frank now do? Well, at Harvard he was teaching physics, relativity, thermodynamics, and philosophy of science, starting with a small course of 15, which then grew to 250, so he needed teaching assistants, which is where I came in. Then publishing. He published 50 items, some books and articles in his life during 28 years in the US, and organization, and this is where we're coming very close to BU. One of them was the Institute for the Unity of Science, of which Bobby Cohen can tell you more because he was one of the managers of it at one point. The other one was, before that, the Interscientific Discussion Group. Interscientific Discussion Group. Eine Verallgemeinerung, a Gesamt sort of thing. Met monthly in Cambridge. There were similar ones under Reichenbach in Los Angeles, Feigl, Minnesota, Morris in Chicago. The virus was spreading. I would like to indicate by one example the quality of these meetings under Philipp Frank in the interdisciplinary discussion group. On March 21, 1945, when many physicists were absent at Los Alamos and elsewhere, the group met to hear and discuss biologist George Wald's presentation called Biology and Social Behavior. On that occasion, there were 32 people present. Now, this was very carefully arranged because if somebody who was invited didn't come 3 times, he no longer was going to be invited. So people would have to write in why they happened not to come. There are some very touching letters in the archives. So there are these 32 who made it and had been there before, or were just new and had been brought in. And the list of signatories in the circulated attendance form still exists. It covers a wide range of specialties, such well-known scholars and scientists as, in that one room there, Talcott Parsons, John Edsel, Gottfried Haberle, Schumpeter, Harlow Shapley, Norbert Wiener, I.A. Richards, George Uhlenbeck, and Giorgio de Santillana. But there were 4 more people there. George Wald, of course, Paul Samuelson, Vasily Leontiev, and P.W. Bridgman, all of whom later got Nobel Prizes. I mention that only to indicate how this self-organizing group was of a quality that is difficult to imagine now to come monthly for their discussions on different topics. In the accounts of other meetings of this same group over the years, there appear names such as Quine, Kepes, von Mises, Roman Jakobsen, Hermann Bondi, Karl Popper, Ernst Nagel, Howard Aiken, John von Neumann, Oskar Morgenstern, Dennis Gabor, Alexander Koyré. It wasn't a Gesamtwissenschaft, obviously, but it was something of an intellectual feast in which they all could participate. Let me only add the obvious. What a privilege it was for a young secretary to arrange these meetings, to listen, to participate, and of course, in my job, then to be followed by Bobby Cohen in that same function. And you now realize how strong the impenetration of the genetic material must have been at that time for some of us. It is not that we became converts at all, but it certainly, thanks to the generosity of this group, it allowed different ways that do have a connection with the earlier message. It is now more than 5 decades since this transfer of missions and responsibilities came here to Boston University when the operations of Philipp Frank ceased in Cambridge. My story here, which goes back 5 decades more, is one, you might agree, of intellectual honor against a series of tragic social events. But I feel I must end with 2 notes. One is optimistic, the other is not. Something has happened that brings us back to the time. There is within science a move toward coalescence. All the great projects that one hears about are really at the intersection of 2 or more sciences. One thinks of genomics itself. One thinks of the fact that interdisciplinarity is the catchword nowadays in science and everywhere else. We have a big lab just built at Harvard, LISE, L-I-S-E, for Laboratory of Integrated Science and Engineering. Can you imagine integrated science and engineering? How the Vienna Circle people would have loved that? Well, it means that if you need facilities for biophysics, that's where it is. It is not Gesamtwissenschaft, but it has an analog. And that is all to the good. We don't know where this is going. If Philipp Frank were with us, he would explain it to us. The other side is more ominous, I think, and maybe is bringing us back right to the very point where young Philip picked up the book by Abel Rey and saw in it a demand to stem the demeaning of science, to fashion a new authority for science, to invigorate philosophy of science. Because during the last few decades, powerful claims against science have again been asserted, raising once more this banner of bankruptcy. I need not give you examples of the excesses of postmodern and constructivist misinterpretations, or the abuse of scientific evidence in politics, or the theologically and ideologically inspired dismissals of science as being merely mechanistic, and here I'm quoting the Pope. We are in some ways right back to the place where Philip took up his battle on behalf of rational analysis of science, of philosophy, of the wider culture of our day. So, ladies and gentlemen, there is work to be done. Thank you. Sure.
How did he become consultant to the Air Force, and what did he accomplish in that capacity?
Yes, he was a consultant to, I'm not sure the Air Force, sometimes I hear it was the Navy, as was the case with Einstein. There are no documents that I have seen which show where it is. The documents may be, they are not at Harvard, they may be elsewhere. But they gave rise to a wonderful moment in history, because one day there was a knock on the door, and two people from the Secret Service came and said to him, "You are working for the government, you have a strong socialist background. Are you not, Mr. Frank? Aren't you perhaps a little bit of an endangerment in our war effort?" And Philipp Frank told me, "So you think I'm a Russian spy?" "Well," they said, "we don't think that yet." "Well," he said, "I can relieve you of this." And he went to the book shelf and he pulled down the copy of Lenin and opened it to the page in which Lenin accused him of being merely a Kantian unbeliever. And the two people saluted him and left. So I think this may have been his best performance for the Air Force or Navy.
Any other questions? Please, can you speak into the microphone, please?
So since time has passed, the effects of philosophy of science and history of science has decayed drastically. In some fundamental way, you could see this happening here in the colloquium. And so isn't it sad that this huge influx of European science and philosophy is decayed into American engineering?
Well, I think this is a rather pessimistic view. Philosophy of science has so many wings, and what I was talking about is just one of them, and always was only one of them. And so there are, when you look at the wonderful programs which have been had, and I think they're displayed over there over the years, you'll see that the Boston University group has been reaching out into so many different places which would have not been resonant at all with what the group in Vienna wanted to do. We must then focus on also on all the other versions of philosophy of science, which are very badly needed as well, and which are going very well. Philosophy of science in this country, I don't think is sick. It is perhaps in the shadow of some of the more aggressive and best-selling enterprises. But the Boston University Center has precisely the function to bring philosophy always to the notice in its best ways, and it does. Can you get another?
Is there one more? Yes, please, Alan.
It's just a brief question about the interscientific discussion group. I'm interested in this as a sort of institutional base from which various things happened, and I'm just wondering to what extent Frank was actually organizing it, or who was organizing it? Was it a joint effort? Was it so? What was the sort of institutionalized structure of the group?
Well, Bobby will tell more about that too. Philipp Frank was a very remarkable combination. He looked a little like that comic character in an old comic strip, Barnaby. He's very small, stooped man. He had been. My wife always said that he never cleaned his eyeglasses, and he didn't need to. He looked in, but he was run over by a bus twice in his life. And so he limped, and he smiled in a wonderful way, and he wrote in a way which afterwards very often he himself couldn't decipher, but he could make it up to his secretary what he would have said if he could read it again. And he had this absolutely charming way of making you do what he wants you to do without you feeling any pressure. You were just simply caught up in his charisma. There is a very telling moment in his, after he was dead, because we had a funeral convocation, a little ceremony, and in that ceremony, all of us who knew him, Tisa, everybody, were there, but there came a man that we had never seen before into that group at the event. And we asked him, what is your connection with Philipp Frank? And he says, oh, I'm just a gardener in Harvard Yard. But I'd often seen him on his way to his cafe house. He didn't use that word. I'll be honest, probably. And by and by, we greeted each other. And when he greeted me, he always raised his hat. And nobody had done that before. And now I wanted to just pay attention to him. There was this feeling that you are now part of him, and you of, and him of you, and you were doing things for him. This immense amount of energy was communicative. And I think Bobby will tell much more about that. So he reached out much more than in that cafe house. He was able to organize international congresses by making many other people do the hard work.
All right. Please join me in thanking Professor Holton.